Hello, the program time about the main events of the day. The brief truce, as many observers had predicted, in Chechnya has not become the beginning of the peace process. The withdrawal of Marine infantry units of the Northern Fleet is postponed. Units have been relocated to carry out combat operations in the south of Grozny. About this a bit later. In Moscow this morning, for the first time, open parliamentary hearings began on the Chechen events. For participation in the Federative Council building on Tsvetnoy Boulevard, prominent figures from the country arrived: Sergei Kovalov, Alexander Rudskoy, Ruslan Khasbulatov, Vladimir Khrushchev, and others. The hearings of the Committee of the State Duma, which investigates reasons for the Chechen crisis, is underway. This format, said the chairman of the commission, Stanislav Gavaruhin, was selected so that everything said here would receive glasnost. And now only on mass media. It will depend to which degree the results of the Committee of Investigations on Chechen events will be passed on to the public. Today's session began with the showing of horrifying films of the Chechen War. Later, the former chairman of the State Committee of Nationality Affairs, Valery Tsitskov, spoke. In his opinion, events in Chechnya were designed by the logic of internal party strife in Russia after the collapse of the USSR. The former KGB chair, Vladimir Khrushchev, said that before August of 1991, the situation in Chechnya didn't seem volatile to the leadership of the country. It began to change when Dudayev gained sympathy of the certain political forces in Moscow because he hid at the Union Center at the USSR and spoke out against the Government Committee on Emergency Situations. And Yusuf Islamberkov, who under the Dudayev regime headed the parliament, answered more concretely. With a certain political aims in Grozny, certain figures emerged: Dudayev, Khasbulatov, Zagayev, and others. Not only Moscow, but they unfortunately stood at the source of the Chechen tragedy. On the other side, the Russian side, they were Burbulis, Poltaranyan, and Starovoytev, who prepared and supplied the coup in the Chechen Republic in the autumn of 1991. Later, Salambek Khadjiev was given an opportunity to speak. We received a typical criminal fascist regime where the automatic rifle was in power, as was force, and there were no laws. Could we have found agreement with Dudayev? That's a serious misconception. That would have been impossible, because Dudayev's main goal was to achieve power, and any control of power instituted over him, he had no intention of permitting, and under no circumstances was he going to permit this. Could we have liquidated this regime otherwise? I don't know. At least all attempts by various people to me seemed unsuccessful. Ruslan Khasbulatov has his own opinion on this account. Since the spring of 1992, definite and very influential forces surrounding Yeltsin began to use the Dudayev regime as an instrument of war with the Supreme Soviet. And in this capacity, it was supported and sustained. Alexander Rudskoy said that events could have been prevented back in the autumn of 1991 by declaring a state of emergency. Then there was a real opportunity to get a handle over what was occurring there. First of all, there was restriction of the number of Dudayev supporters and restrictions on weapons, because the theft at the stockpiles of the catered divisions occurred. The manned divisions occurred after Dudayev, the 27th of October, was elected president of Chechnya. Then a total relinquishing of weapons of the Russian army had occurred. But the operation had failed then, in the opinion of Yegor Gaidat, because of the lack of coordination of the actions of the Russian and Allied force structures. The internal affairs forces were receiving contradictory instructions from Russian organs of power, specifically from the Vice President Rudskoy, and from Allied organs of power, specifically President Gorbachev. Overall, this indicated a most profound crisis among all the force structures. The only idea where all these speakers today agreed on, the main thing today, is to stop combat operations. And again, back to the chronicle of today's events in Chechnya. One may add to this that the first group of volunteers who have signed contracts flew out from the Komsomolsk on the Amur to carry out military service in the zone of the Chechen conflict. As the correspondent of Tartas was told in the city military recruiting department, the majority of volunteers are workers from industrial companies of the city undergoing a deep economic crisis. In Chechnya, during the last day, federal forces continued to blockade Grozny. However, they were not actively engaged in combat, Dudaev gunmen often fired at positions of law and order forces. A sniper bullet injured a soldier of the Russian Internal Affairs. A soldier of the Russian Internal Affairs. Since the beginning, they've lost around 60. 296 military were injured or incapacitated. In Grozny, in conducting a reconnaissance search mission, tens of mines, grenades and shells were defused. Basic efforts of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia contingents are concentrated on protecting and defending points of temporary positioning of subdivisions, of units, communications and major objects. The plant, Red Hammer, where Dudaev fighters prepared combat technology and produced the Borsvolk automatic rifle, are also under reliable guard. And the expensive products will now go only for metal purposes. The Commandant's office of Grozny is handling reception and control and delivery and distribution of humanitarian aid. In the first Commandant's district, a medical clinic is opened. In the third, an ambulance division. And in the old industrial region, a hospital and 7 stores have been opened. Everything is being done to return a peaceful life to the city. In Grozny, we see as our main objective to, as soon as possible, restore the life activity of the city, primarily because circumstances are such in the majority of the city now that it is disrupted. Administrative districts were set up, where our representatives are working jointly with administrative organs of the local rule, and life has resumed in the city, in the capital. The time limits for normalizing lifestyle here will not change, as we had cited previously. Analysis indicates that truly by the end of the month, life here will be relatively normalized. For us, a big problem now is to dress up the law enforcement organs, to buff them up, and especially organs of internal affairs. A large group of the central apparatus of the ministry is deployed and is conducting certification for employees of the internal affairs forces. Departments are forming and entire sections of the ministry, not just in Grozny, but in other regions as well. Everyone is tired of this war. In several populated points of Ingushetia adjacent with Chechnya, as of today, for 1 month, martial law is imposed because of the escalation of the criminal situation. A decree on this was signed by the president of Ingushetia, Ruslan Alshev. The president of Northern Ossetia, Akhsatbek Galazov, stated today announced his intention to sign a treaty on friendship and cooperation between Northern Ossetia and Ingushetia. In his opinion, revoking the state of emergency on parts of the territory of Northern Ossetia and Ingushetia has introduced a certain element of tension, but the process of returning displaced persons to their former residence is underway in a forward motion. An investigation is underway in several directions of what occurred in Chechnya. The failure on the part of the federal forces and the enormous losses sustained during the operation were caused to a great degree because of unreliable information provided by the Federal Service of Counterintelligence. This was stated by the commander of the air paratrooper forces, the Colonel General Yevgeny Podkolzin. Our correspondent was at that press conference, which he gave today. But strategic errors were permitted. This was stated at the press conference by the commander of the air paratrooper forces of Russia, Yevgeny Podkolzin, assessing the actions of Russian leadership in Chechnya. In his opinion, the timing for launching the operation was extremely poor when more senior military were being discharged and conscription of young soldiers was underway. Because of the poor weather conditions, aviation could be deployed only 5 to 6 days per month and at high altitudes from where it's difficult to execute precise and effective blows. Finally, armed forces entering Chechnya were completely unaware of the type of adversary they would encounter there. If the director of the Federal Service of Counterintelligence said we wanted to fight with criminals and convicts who were released, but here there was a well-prepared army, which we found, I want to ask, who should have reported this? Who is responsible for reporting this in the country? The commander of the Combat Air Force or the Minister of Defense? Probably no. The Federal Service of Counterintelligence should know because they were paid for this for 3 years. Incorrect information led to unjustified losses. Yevgeny Podkolzin says that 244 paratroopers have been killed, 959 injured. I want to report that I gave an interview that the paratroopers should not surrender. The commander of the air paratrooper forces said the ceasefire achieved is beneficial mostly for Dudaev to win time time, wait for spring, gather new force, and resume combat in the spring. Such harsh statements as were made today by the General Podkozy regarding the FSK. As a rule, denial quickly follows, and so it was. The head of the Center of Public Communications of the FSK, General Alexander Mikhailov, submitted his refutation. This is the personal view of the general, who was not involved in the combat, in connection with which he personally was not provided with any information. The direct commander of the military groupings, the generals Rokhlin and Babichev, several times emphasized the effectiveness and significance of information supplied by the FSK. The Chechen war is underway. Certain conclusions are already being made. Specifically, the Ministry of Defense assesses the quality of combat technology. During combat in Chechnya, the Russian army lost more than 10% of combat technology deployed, 225 units, of them 62 tanks. These figures were reported to the Minister of Defense of Russia, Pavel Grachev, by the head of the Department of Combat Tank Forces, Alexander Galkin, at the Scientific Practical Conference devoted to the problem of survivability of combat vehicles. Every time when an army is involved in real combat, it forces not only the military, but the designers and builders of the combat technology to think. Specialists of the defense industry presented a series of devices protecting the most vulnerable parts of tanks and armored combat vehicles during street clashes. Although inaccessible in field battle for which these vehicles are intended, tanks operated and demonstrated the modifications in action. Shooting at tanks and armored vehicles was from a close distance range from all types of anti-tank artillery, including powerful tank cannons, targeting the most vulnerable parts. The result was not bad at all. The tanks returned from the simulated battlefield along their own routes with minimum damage. Pavel Grachev expressed regret regarding the fact that during the storming of Grozny, these defense systems were not deployed, emphasizing, however, that participation of the tanks in the storming was justified because it reduced losses. The minister made a slip of the tongue, saying the losses were 3 to 4 times less than planned in preparing the operation. By evening, Interfax reported the words of the Minister of Defense of Pavel Grachev further, who said that the operation to free Grozny has no analogies in the world. For the first time, forces were given the objective of taking control of the city, but with minimum damage to buildings. Several news items of the day on political events in the CIS countries, but first of all, again, Russia. We more frequently remember today the fables of Krylov, which are a parody on base human behavior and opportunism and ineptness. Politicians are more engrossed in strife against each other. The deputy of the Duma of Russia, Irina Khakhamada, doesn't intend to join the movement The National Rebirth, created by her colleague and her faction Boris Fedorov. To Interfax, she said that Fedorov has been afflicted with the power hunger illness, and he feels that he can create a party single-handedly which will achieve some sort of a revolutionary coup. The General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Beer Lovers Party, Konstantin Kalachev, denied assertions of the leader of the Party of Economic Freedom, Konstantin Borovoy, that his party was created by intelligent people from the analytical department of the KGB, and the national idea of that party could easily become a fascist idea. Kalachev refutes all this vehemently. Now I'll direct your attention to the second round of parliamentary elections held in Kyrgyzia. As far as we know, not everything went smoothly there. Incidentally, more precise information from our Kyrgyzstan representative, Vladimir Fedorov. Today, the Central Election Commission is flooded with complaints and protests and is not prepared to issue exhaustive results of yesterday's elections for the new Kyrgyzstan parliament. We unofficially were told that the elections, which were expected in the district, were held. Participating in the election was more than 61% of the voters. I'll remind you, the first round gathered around 70%, yet the boycott of elections, as was urged on the eve by representatives of the Bishkekian intelligentsia, was unsuccessful. Here, unanimous thinkers have gathered. We are people who want to see a bright Kyrgyzstan, without corruption and without bribery. Those who say that they knew what was happening and knew yesterday, why then were they silent? We are not yet a nation. We unfortunately are still a gathering of clans and tribes, etc. The President of the Republic yesterday told the press that one can't ignore public opinion, yet what is the sense of waving fists after a fistfight? Askarakayev intends to strictly adhere to the letter of the law on elections, which was adopted by the previous parliament, despite the proposal of the President on proportionate representation and quotas for parties and social organizations and ethnic groups. What is clear today, that is that it will be a parliament without Russians, mononational international in essence, and in essence it will be a one-party system, a communist party parliament of one gender, without women, and also without representatives of the working-class farmers and the labor intelligentsia. The cream of society had soured back in the first round. Today, our correspondent in Armenia finally made contact with us, Vladimir Nazaran. He managed lately to deliver reports only infrequently because of the absence of electrical power. But today, that's not the issue. Today, in Yerevan, a rally was held on the 7th anniversary of the Karabakh movement. 7 years ago on this day, on Freedom Square in Yerevan, then it was called Theatrical Square, the first rally of thousands of people for the Karabakh movement during these years had grown into a large-scale armed conflict. Fatigued and exhausted because of the war, active mediating efforts of international organizations, the OSCE and Russia mostly, for a long time had existed. They extinguished the fire of confrontation. Since the 12th of May of last year, no active combat at Nagorno-Karabakh is seen, and it would seem that here is the long-awaited path to peace. But unfortunately, even at the last round of talks held in Moscow at the beginning of February under the aegis of the Minsk group of the OSCE on resolving the Karabakh conflict, there was no real progress toward a final peace. Meanwhile, alternatives to a peaceful political and not a military solution for the problem, a confirmation of that is the last 7 years, does not exist. The state advisor of Azerbaijan on foreign political issues feels that progress in resolving the Karabakh conflict, which today, as our correspondent just told you, has turned 7 years of age, is hindered by a third force which fears losing levers of influence on Armenia and Azerbaijan. What the third power is not specified. Regarding Russian-Ukrainian talks on the delicate question of the Black Sea Fleet, today it seems that the Gordian knot was untied. This I quote the aide of the President of Ukraine on regional policies, Vladimir Grignot. He spoke today at Sevastopol before the public of the city and said that the division of the Black Sea Fleet is underway. The Ukrainian fleet will be based at Balaklava, that is near Sevastopol. As is known, previously Ukraine had insisted on keeping the base at Sevastopol. In the Russian Economic Chronicle, as previously, the rate of the dollar draws attention. The Russian ruble, in trading at the Moscow Interbank Currency Exchange, again today fell by 25 points compared to the session Friday and comprised 4,339 rubles for $1. Scientists of the Russian Academy of Sciences called critical the financial situation of science in the country. In Moscow at a press conference, Will Science Remain in Russia? It was said that the minimum funds necessary for the development of science in 1995 are 12 trillion rubles, whereas in the draft budget there is only 5.5 trillion entered. And yet scientists do have something to be proud of, but they say that the period of semi-collapse of science is 5 years. Today we mark a date. For 9 years, the orbital station Mir is in space. During its exploitation on the station, 16 basic crews were at work and 12 international crews. For more than 8 years, people are navigating the flight of the station Mir. Now on board the orbital complex is the crew of the 17th Basic Expedition, Alexander Viktorenko, Elena Kondakova, and Dr. Valery Polyakov. According to reports from orbit and telemetric data, the flight of Mir is proceeding in normal fashion. Condition of health and disposition of the cosmonauts is good. Around the Soros Fund, which aids Russian science and research, as you probably know, quite a noisy scandal occurred. Today, the operations of the fund in Russia was supported by the participants of parliamentary hearings. All suspicions that the operations of the Soros Fund are aimed at export of Russian intellectual power abroad have no basis. This was stated at the hearings by one of the participants of the Soros education program in precise sciences, Vsevolod Borisov. As is known in the press, information was published, ostensibly based on the report of the FSK, where it said that this department is concerned by the activities of American researchers in Russia. Parts of this labor gyroscope are covered with a sealant of molecular proportion, and the levels of other gases here doesn't exceed 1/10 of a millionth part of its entire volume. These sizes are difficult to explain and almost impossible to show. Such technologies exist only in 2 countries, the United States and in Russia. In the Moscow Institute of electromechanics and automatics. These devices are assembled by hand because in order to develop and launch automated assembly lines is so expensive that the cost of the device will be equivalent to the weight in gold of such proportion. Even parts before assembly are welded into glass containers. Western partners watched this unique production method for a long time, but to work on an equal basis, one must join in with technologies and techniques of the same high level as in Russia. And finally, using the Russian saying, measure 7 times but cut only once, the German firm Daimler-Benz Aerospace has signed an agreement to create a joint company, Davia, with a Russian aviation device. The company will now develop and produce onboard electronic equipment and air navigational systems for the CIS countries, and that's an enormous market, and for countries in the Western market as well. Russia has made its first step into European cooperation in aircraft construction. Maybe soon we'll see on the graphics of the plane assembly in France, Toulouse, that the engines are made in Sweden, the gauge displays in France, and electronic equipment in Russia. The joint work cooperation significantly decreases political, military, and other intergovernmental barriers. Meanwhile, in Russia, prematurely, the heating season may end, specifically in the Ivanov district. Fuel at the heating station is enough only until the middle of March. To replenish its supply, funds are needed, and they are neither in the city budget nor among the Ivanovsky power stations. This is reported by Intertas today, but our correspondent managed to see something pleasant. From her oldest relative, the Vasniva, we juxtaposed them intentionally for the filming. The Shuisky Jeep differs not only by its larger body and broader interior. The frame with aerodynamic profiles and the fiberglass used as a material for the body make the vehicle more sturdy, increase its longevity, and it has better maneuverability because of its lower weight and width of tires. But the most important feature is that with the catastrophic employment situation in the region, it's a real perspective for salaries for hundreds of people. Basic orders for parts, the joint stock company Teza distributes basically among the local auto manufacturing suppliers. Here, they are attempting to find more shareholders and count on government or bank loans. That is, even in the conditions of a depressed region with the highest unemployment in Russia. One may start up a new venture if one, of course, entrusts capital not to many Hapyor Invest-type pyramid schemes with their patriotic slogans, but to the Ivanov people who have learned to work in the new style. News from abroad. Washington is consulting with NATO allies prior to sending a letter to the President of Russia. The draft letter of Bill Clinton already exists and was discussed in an informal setting in the NATO Council. Details are not known. However, they say that NATO's position regarding the broadening of the bloc didn't undergo significant change. Official figures of South Korea have stated that North Korea is increasing its military preparation. North Korea did indeed test new rockets with a radius of action of 1,500 kilometers. The South Korean Minister of Defense said that the new missile installations have sufficient potential to destroy Seoul. The head of the Palestinian National Administration, Arafat, urges Russia, the United States, European countries, and Egypt to provide a new impulse into the peace process in the Middle East. Peace is needed not only for Palestinians, but for Israelis and for all. And now we need the support of all our friends, he emphasized in an interview to the French company TF1. Meanwhile, Israeli Air Force planes continue to launch strong blows on bases of pro-Iranian groups of Hezbollah in South Lebanon. At least 8 have died and there are injured. The Israeli bombing was a response to the attacks by Hezbollah gunmen on posts of the pro-Israeli army of South Lebanon. At the same time, the government of Israel has partially lifted the blockade on occupied territories. Almost 15,000 Palestinians from the Gaza sector and the west bank of the Jordan River were permitted to return to work in Israel. The blockade was imposed the 22nd of January and led to a serious deterioration of the material state of local Arabs, for the majority of whom work in Israel is the only means of survival. The UN plan to achieve peace in Afghanistan is apparently under threat because of demands submitted by the leaders of Taliban, whose regiments have seized 10 provinces of the country. Today they entered the Afghan capital. With details, our observer Alexander Shkeranze. The situation on the fronts of the Afghan war for a long time cannot be logically understood, and yet, if previously the reason for the senseless fratricidal conflict, which was begun almost 3 years ago, ended in clearly articulated struggles for supreme power between the President Rabbani and the Prime Minister Hikmatyar, then now, with the appearance in Kabul of regiments of the mysterious Talibs, who are students of spiritual schools as they call themselves, the situation has become completely confusing. Again, the UN mission appears helpless, which suggested another peace plan, which today was to take effect. It provides for President Rabbani transferring power to the new organ, the Temporary Ruling Council. However, leaders of the Taliban movement presented their plan, which is rather like an ultimatum, unconditional conveyance of power and disarmament of all Mujahid armed groups. The population of Afghanistan, exhausted by endless clashes, actively supported this movement, which 4 months ago counted only 800 supporters, and today it is a 25,000-strong army with an arsenal of almost 200 units of combat technology and more than tens of bomber planes. Another thing is important. From where did these combat-gifted clerics emerge who, not with the help of the Quran, but through contemporary weaponry, perhaps for the first time, have forced the insubordinate leaders of the Mujahids into subjugation? Maybe many explain the new turns and developments in Afghanistan with the hand of Pakistan, which for a long time wants the market of the region, and that path is blocked by warring groups of Mujahids. And so Afghanistan, on the eve of yet another change of power, and perhaps the division of the entire country into separate principalities, this was unambiguously implied by the leader of the Uzbek formations in northern Afghanistan, General Dostum, who announced his intention to create his own kingdom, which will directly be adjacent to the borders of the former Soviet Union in the south. An enormous burial procession passed through Tehran. They buried 3,000 Iranian military who died during the Iran-Iraqi war from 1980 to 1988, whose remains were just recently found on the territory of south and western Iran. As was reported, participating in the burial ceremony were the Iranian spiritual leader Ayatollah Khomeini and the President Akbar Hashemi. A group of 50 people invaded the territory of the Windsor Castle, the suburban residence of the Queen of Great Britain Elizabeth II, as a sign of protest against what Parliament recently adopted, a new criminal code. They were protesting specifically the statute in the law which bans entry onto the territory of personal property and views even simple trespassing as a matter for criminal prosecution. According to the UN, the world population annually increases by almost 90 million people, and today we number 5.6 billion on this planet. Take note, in 1992 in Asia there was 3,231,000,000 people, and by the year 2025, 4 billion plus is expected to be the population. It may turn out that this figure may be approached more quicker than we think, as it happened in China. People in the mountains, people on the sea. This ancient saying about the large number of the Chinese population has acquired a material illustration in children's painting. The collective portrait of the country is made by young artists on the day when, according to specialists, the population of the continent has exceeded 1,200,000,000. China is prepared to reach this figure at the end of the century, and this is the aim of all the efforts of control of population growth by encouraging later marriages and restricting the number of children to one. But life made its own changes. Yet, planned birth rate remains one of the priority directions in the government's work. According to the Vice Premier Zhou Jiahua, such a self-restriction is not a whim, but necessity given China's limited resources. The reduction of the demographic pressures in the last decades has facilitated more economic reforms, and however, the realism of reform through the prism of which China views the birth rate problem lately has illuminated new sore spots. The new children are more frequently called the spoiled generation. An only child, if not completely self-centered, is at least a small despot, knowing no refusal and demanding more and more consistently. But the main hidden stone, according to demographers, is the closet preference for boys as the heirs to the family line. To avoid intrauterine discrimination, the authorities recently even banned gender determination during ultrasound of the uterus. This evoked the disappointment of many potential parents, of course, but in the situation now, China does not have any choice. If this trend continues in the beginning of the next century, millions of tiny contemporary emperors will be doomed to a futile quest for their half of the sky. The next report is from France. In Paris today, they're speaking of the Ivanovsky horsemen. Yes, it's been a long time, since 1814. One may think Paris has not seen Russian horses in its streets, and now they've come. From Ivanovo, they brought 4 participants of the mounted around-the-world expedition, and a 5th joined them in Belarus. But in the beginning, 2.5 years ago, the first level of this marathon was held, of a distance of 8,500 kilometers from Ivanovo to southern Sakhalinsk, and those were honored with their entry into the Guinness Book of Records. During it, the idea emerged to reach Sakhalin, but this time through the Western Hemisphere. In May of last year, embarking on a long journey was a magnificent group of travelers and 4 hardy wagon-pulling horses from Vladimir, who with ease, as we noted, captured the attention of the Parisian women here. At times, the clanging of a coin supplements their voyages in the money box, but this is only at the stops. Overall, the world expedition is slowly moving along, surely, because of sponsors along the road by local equestrian clubs who warmly greet our adventure seekers. In truth, they have to seek not so much adventure, but the solutions for many problems which arise. From Paris, we're headed for Port Gavre, where our main problem will be to find a ship which will transport us to America, because the route will continue through America, Canada, and to Sakhalin. Well, that's our style, with the bare minimum of necessity and with great will, desire, openness of the heart, and faith in human kindness and solidarity. The fellows pursue their set mission. And how can it be otherwise? They, more than anyone else, have to know that once you take on the yoke, you must measure up to it. Prior to bidding you farewell, I think that perhaps I'll gladden many of you, but of course not everyone. It seems that very soon on Channel 1 Ostankino you will no longer see any advertising. Incidentally, the statement of the Board of Directors, the joint stock company Public Television, I was asked to read in full. And so the founders of Russian Public Television expressed their adamant will that television should be the instrument of accord in society. The work of Russian Public Television is accountable to a trustees' council which is headed by the President of the Russian Federation. Among the members of the council is representative government, scientists, artists, writers, and people whose civil positions in this crucial period have an enormous positive influence. We understand the value and significance of Ostankino for the Russian public, it says in the statement of the Board of Directors of the joint stock company Public Television. During the course of many years, Ostankino remains the most large-scale and authoritative source of information. In the last years, the company found itself in difficult circumstances because of political conflicts, shortage of money, the clash of group interests, and bureaucratic arbitrariness. The position of the company was seriously shaken. Our aim is to preserve all the best of which was created and give opportunity to journalists to continually cover events, express their positions, and create dignified conditions for their work in doing so. The Board of Directors of Public Russian Television states also its unique position vis-à-vis television advertisements. Lately, it has become a source of extreme irritation and disappointment. Therefore, it says here, we have adopted the decision not to include commercial advertisements in the programs of Public Russian Television until such time that appropriate requirements for advertising are rigidly enforced in the interests of economic development of society and moral criteria. Mutual understanding and accord in society, and hence creativity, this is the aim which is pursued by the founders of Public Russian Television. Today, of course, we still will have that, and then after that, the sports news. Thanks for your attention. All the best. Good evening, my friends. Performing magnificently at the World Floor Hockey Championships in Sweden was the youth team of Russia. The 16-year-old hockey players won all 5 matches with a difference between scored and missed balls of 25-3. In the finale, our youths literally crushed their peers from Finland 5-0 and won the gold medals. The 3-time Wimbledon winner, the German tennis player Boris Becker, this season has won 4 straight straight tournaments. And this time in the finals in Milan, his rival was Evgeny Kafelnikov, Russia's top-seeded player. The Sochi player almost sensed the taste for victory, confidently winning the first set 7-5, later lost 5-7, and in the end won and received a purse of $128,000. The regular games were held in the International Hockey League in the Eastern Zone. Lada, visiting, managed to avenge itself for yesterday's defeat by the Automobilist with the same score, 4-1. Molot again beat Saravat Kristal 4-3. And Metallurg from Novokuznetsk lost at home to Avangard 3-4. In the United States, the World Speed Skating Championships have ended. Beyond the competitions was the host of the tournament, the many-time Olympic champion, the famous American Bonnie Blair. A silver medal, and that's nice, went to the Irkutsk athlete Oksana Ravilova. Among the men, the best was Kim Yerman from South Korea. Sergei Kluchev from Barnaul was only in 6th. The first victory was held by the 24-year-old Australian Marirator at the World Giant Slalom Championships in Japan. And again, misfortune besieged the famous Italian Alberto Tombo, although he leads by a colossal margin in the overall count.
Добрый вечер.
Good evening. Tomorrow on the Kolik Peninsula in Karelia in the Arkhangelsk district, in the zone of an atmospheric front, it will be cloudy with wet snow mixed with rain, temperatures from -3 to +2 degrees. In the Nenetsk Autonomous District in the Republic of Komi and the Volgovelsk region, in the afternoon, under the influence of an atmospheric front, cloudiness will increase and snow will fall. On the coast, blizzards are possible during the day, 0-5. In the northwestern region, in the Baltic countries, the Kaliningrad district, at night it will be cloudy with some isolated patches of wet snow, temperatures around 0. During the day, partly cloudy skies, precipitation will cease and it will warm up to +4 to 7. Weather of the central and central Chernozem regions, the east of Ukraine and central Volga area, will be defined by a cyclone and atmospheric fronts. Here it will be cloudy, snow mixed with rain, with icy road conditions during the day, 0+5. In Belarus, the north of Ukraine, in a belt of high pressure, no significant precipitation, temperatures 0+5. In the central parts of Ukraine and in Moldova, an atmospheric front will cause cloudy and rainy weather. Day temperatures +5 to 10 degrees. On the lower Volga, in the Stavropol, Krasnodar Rim areas, in the Rostov district, and in the republics of the northern Caucasus, in the zone of an atmospheric front, cloudy with wet snow mixed with rain, with icy road conditions during the day, +3 to 8. In northern Ossetia, Ingushetia, and in the Chechen Republic at night around 0, during the day +5 to 7. In the south of the Krasnodar and Stavropol Rim areas is warm, +12 to 15. Near Tuapse and Sochi, brief periods of rain, +8 to 12 degrees. In the republics beyond the Caucasus, partly cloudy skies. In Azerbaijan, rain is possible. Temperatures of +5 to 10 in the valleys of Georgia and Azerbaijan, as high as +15. In St. Petersburg, cloudy with some periods of rain, at night around 0, during the day +1 to 3 degrees. In Moscow, gradually cloud cover will increase. Some patches of snow mixed with rain. At night, -3 to 5. During the day, +1 to 3 with icy road conditions. The forecast was compiled on the data of the Oceanic Meteorological Center. All the best. Goodbye.